the presenters from this session will be 4 people who were part of the gathering in Snowmass in 2017. And they're going to tell us where life and centering prayer has taken them since then. So it is with great joy that I will introduce their moderator, Rafael from the Dominican Republic. And he is a workshop facilitator for centering prayer, as well as a member of Extensión Contemplativa Internacional. And for that reason, the rest of this session will be in Spanish. Only kidding. We wish. Maybe next time. But he was part of the group of younger people who gathered in Snowmass in 2017. And he's a lawyer with a PhD in administrative law. So if you have any questions, you know who to go to. He loves to help and assist others and firmly believes in service as a life mission. So, Rafael, it's all yours.
Muchas gracias, Carol. Ahora voy a hablar en español, ¿no?
Muy bien.
Yeah, just kidding. Well, thank you very much, Carol. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here with all of you in this conference that has been guided by the Holy Spirit to connect, share, and deepen with the worldwide contemplative outreach community. As some of you may know, in 2016, the founder of 4 contemplative movement, Father Thomas Keating of Contemplative Outreach, Father Laurence Freeman of the World Community of Christian Meditation, Father Rohr of Center of Action and Contemplation, and Tilden Edwards of the Shalom Institute gathered for a week of dialogue and meditation at St. Benedict Monastery in Snowmass. As a result of that meeting, they came up with an extraordinary idea to gather a group of committed generation of contemplatives of their respective movement to share for a few days on the practice of contemplative prayer. That meeting took place in 2017 with the intention to promote an exchange of our evolving experience, understanding, and practice of Christian contemplative prayer among practitioners from different backgrounds, cultures, and affiliations. Some could say that the purpose of the gathering was to know and relate each other on a more profound spiritual and personal level, just how we are doing in this conference globally. We have among us 3 others that will be sharing today with us how the move of the Spirit has been doing in their life and how is the work they've been doing. So we'll start hearing from Stuart Higginbotham. He is a director or head of staff of Grace Episcopal Church in Gainsville, Georgia, where he has served for almost 8 years. He did his Master of Divinity Studies at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and received his Doctor of Ministry degree from the School of Theology at the University of South. He has also done further studies and work with the Shalom Institute for Spiritual Formation, and he is particularly grateful for Tilden Edwards' guidance and counsel for many years. He is the co-editor of a great book of Contemplation and Community, a gathering of fresh voice for living tradition, and is the author of the forthcoming book, The Heart of the Covenant, which will be published this fall. He also gathers sermons and reflection on his blog, contemplativereformative.com. Let's hear from you, Stuart. Good always to see you.
It's so good to be here with all of you. It's been a joy to sit in on some of the presentations, and thank you. Thank you for all of the hard work that's gone into planning and replanning again in these COVID days. Thank you for the chance to share a few thoughts with you about where I and where we as a group sense the Spirit's movement, looking especially at how our practice continues to shape and to nurture us. I think these conversations and the mutual encouragement around contemplative practice are essential in these days of struggle and disorientation and reorientation. In my own life, my daily times of prayer and the accumulated resonance of the practice over the years, I believe this has helped ground me as I respond to the challenges of my own context as a pastor. So I'm thankful for the chance to share a few thoughts with you from my own experience of where I see the Spirit at work. I want to start with a Bible verse. In the letter of James, we find this pointed image that calls us to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Each of us lives our lives and seeks to embody our vocations within the context of where we work, where we live, raise our families, and carry out the often mundane acts of everyday life. To have a vocation means that God calls out from us the deeper dream that God has for each one of us within our personal lives, each one of us and every one of us. I am a parish priest. I didn't start out that way. I went to undergrad as a young Baptist to study to be a physician. I was pre-med in college, getting a degree in biology before I realized that I was absolutely terrified of hospitals, illnesses, germs, and basically all bodily fluids. If biology means the study of life, I like to think that I took a different path to actually live this out, where I was led on a different path. What does it mean to study life in its depths? How do we understand the meaning of our existence, our true identity? These are the deeper questions that I think congregations are meant to explore. I ended up at seminary, honestly, by a circuitous route. My wife, my fiance at the time, and I moved to Georgia to study in grad school, and I started seminary to do more academic work until I fell in love with Greek and with Hebrew and with ancient texts that describe centuries of encounters with the divine presence. My heart resonated as I learned about the wisdom and the practices of the Christian contemplative tradition. Here was a truly profound study of life. As I prepared for ordination, first within the Presbyterian Church and ultimately within the Episcopal Church, I immediately noticed a tension between the more formal, dare I say, stodgy structure and the lived experience of the practices that stirred my own soul. I remember sitting in liturgy class and I would find myself sitting quietly for too long after a particularly imaginative sermon or a hymn until someone cleared their throat and prompted me to move on. I could think of nothing more appropriate than to sit and rest in the silence, to soak up the beauty of the mystical encounter that I had just had. Friends, as we see in the broader Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, and even wider context, in its original meaning, the word mysticism referred to the lived and the embodied and conscious experience and the participation of people within the framework of the liturgy and the sacramental life of the church community. There was a conscious participation within the worship, and this lived experience of God's presence was in reality mystical. We see this with the origin of the word sacramentum itself, pointing toward the mystery of God's presence and our participation in it. To worship was to experience a mystical encounter. But as the church became more and more institutionalized, for many, such a felt encounter with the mystery of God was squeezed out, to be replaced, if we're honest, by a concern of institutional preservation, political power, or social prestige. Now, some scholars now tell us in many ways how we understand mysticism now really finds its roots in a medieval development which is grounded in a response to this over-institutionalization of the church. We can understand it this way. With the decrease in conscious participation with the mystery within the liturgy, we see the desire for a mystical encounter with God's presence shift away from where it unfortunately feels absent. Now we're talking about personal mystical experience, often outside of the traditional context of the church. And that's where my vocation takes place, is in that tension, in that space. This tension between a more rigid institutional framework and the desire for a mystical encounter is not new. It's age old, and it's not even confined to Christianity, of course. I've been reading about St. Simeon, the new theologian in 10th century Constantinople. After he stressed the need for such a conscious participation in the light of God, he was exiled by the church authority and sent to an abandoned monastery with a small community. But there, their conscious participation continued, and the abandoned monastery was rebuilt, and they thrived. We can think of many other examples that stretch across the 2 millennia of the Christian community's existence. Think of all the Benedictine reform movements and other orders within Roman Catholicism. Think of the Beguines and the lay spiritual movement in Europe. Think of the base communities even in Latin America and the lived reality of hope, peace, and justice. At certain moments, there is a contemplative rejuvenation that is called forth that reminds us of what is most essential, the one thing necessary that we hear in the gospel. This is where my vocation rests, with engaging this tension within the church itself. I'm curious about a revival or a reformation, if you will, of the traditional congregational context so that we reclaim this felt experience, this mystical element of God's presence within the life of the parish. The mystical and the corporate, if you will, or the institutional or the established, what word feels best to you, they need not be opposed because they were not originally opposed. They were not originally at odds. Because the deep essence of contemplation is an awareness of the indwelling presence of God in all of life. The corporate life encouraged the corpus, the gathered body, the body of Christ, to live into the fullness of God's dream for us. In our bulletins on Sunday morning at Grace, where I serve, at the presentation at communion, we all say together these lines from St. Augustine: "Behold who you are, the body of Christ. May we become what we receive." And in that moment, time itself seems to collapse, to fold, as our current existence becomes suffused with future hope in the reality of God's love. All this being said, how I understand and ground myself in my own practice is absolutely vital as we continue to wonder about such a reformation of the parish's life. Left to its own, there's a sort of gravity that will pull parish ministry into a pattern of program maintenance and institutional preservation that we all know far too well. And that pattern is much more flavored by the culture's notion of success and accomplishment than it is by the Spirit's dream for trust and compassion and prayer. I couldn't help but think about this in my own life as a parish priest as I watched the SpaceX rocket launch on Wednesday, which was fascinating. The rocket needed a certain thrust to move it past gravity's pull so that it could fly into orbit. To play with the metaphor a bit, perhaps the fuel that was loaded in the rocket is like the Spirit's presence in us, but the spark being our desire to allow ourselves to yield and consent through our practice, to allow ourselves so that we can feel the Spirit move us into a higher orbit. I'm still playing with this, but my experience in parish ministry definitely shows that the culture's values will be the predominant influence on the parish unless some spiritual force is applied to nurture a reorientation. But then that raises a question for us. How do we understand such a spiritual force in terms of actually consenting to the Spirit's call? Do we understand consenting as a force? Here, I think Father Thomas would remind us of the need to cultivate our intention. In my own life in a parish, contemplative prayer has been essential on two fronts. And this is what I see in my current life and in conversations with friends. The nurture of contemplative practice, it exists in two areas or spheres. One is by intentionally engaging my own personal practice, and also by encouraging a persistent deepening of the community's own contemplative life. It's helped me to actually consider those distinctly, even as in my case, they're intimately connected. Put another way, what is the parish's spiritual work and what is my own? I have a deep desire to support the community's engagement on the level of what Tilden and all of us would recognize as the spiritual heart. How can we name our intention to cultivate a deeper trust in the Spirit's movement as opposed to the culture's obsession with so-called success and consumerism? How can we support simplicity and trust in the face of anxiety, fear, and political manipulation? How can we consistently strengthen our own familiarity with the wisdom of the contemplative tradition while resisting the pernicious political shorthand that supports division? How can the congregation become more conscious of God's indwelling presence within them, inviting them to embody faith, hope, and love in the world today? That is my hope. And this desire is lived out daily with the pressure of parish life, with pastoral care, worship planning, staff meetings, the needs of a preschool, and financial and property management. Even in this past month with lightning strikes. Yesterday, when we were looking at the financial updates, I thought of that good adage, good administration is good pastoral care. I think that's very true. And I would add that good contemplation enables good administration. So I think of these past 18 months in my own life and how the disruption of our typical ways of worshiping and being a community have highlighted, on one hand, the need for comfort and predictability, and on the other hand, the ease at which we become rigid and want to return to the way we have always done it. The intensity of this disruption has been hard on us all, with a particular pain for clergy who feel caught in systems that are anxious about declining budgets and membership. Those pressures are real as we constantly see the pressure of the culture's values and listen deeply for the Spirit's call to trust. I'm still learning every day how essential that my own contemplative practice is to help me stay centered in the midst of what I believe is a watershed moment for the traditional parish church, no matter what denomination that we belong in. As waves of the virus sweep through, along with waves of social and political dysfunction and insanity. Each day when I go into the office or work from home, I have no idea what will come my way. Ministry begins to feel like walking through one of those haunted houses at the fair where creatures randomly jump out at you and grab your ankles. Anxiety is high and fear is always present, it seems. And yet the call of the psalmist persists. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know. Be still and be. So I guess you could say that my desire for my congregation is rooted in my awareness of their struggle, because it is my own struggle. And I know how my contemplative practice is helping to save my soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. That was wonderful and so much needed. Introduce the contemplative practice in the church ministry in Latin America. We do. I mean, in my case, I didn't know any contemplative practice in the church I was attending. So thankfully, I was able to meet the need outside the church that mostly happened to many of us. So I think this conversation that you bring to us is great, and it's really important at this moment. Well, I will now want to introduce Helena Heuertz. Phileena is an author, spiritual director, yoga instructor, public speaker, and retreat guide with a passion for spirituality and making the world a better place. She had been very involved in social justice work among the world's poor. In 2012, Phileena co-founded Gravity to support the development of consciousness by making contemplative practice more widely accessible. She holds a Master of Christian Spirituality from Creighton University Department of Theology and is a trauma-informed certified spiritual director in the Ignition Contemplative Evocative Method, with an emphasis on tree-centered awareness. She is a board member emeritus for Duke Divinity School Center for Reconciliation and Richard's Rohr Center of Action and Contemplation. She's an author of a great book, Pilgrimage of Soul and Mindful Silence. Thank you, Phileena, for joining us and share your story.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you to everyone at Contemplative Outreach for inviting Stewart and Justin and myself. It's really an honor to be with you, and I hope that something of what we share will be inspiring and encouraging, and certainly we are following in all of your footsteps, and I want to really express my gratitude for your practice. Your practice over the years, I believe, has been an integral part of the evolution of consciousness. And without your practice, you know, the three of us might not be where we are today in terms of our own spiritual journey and various ministries. And so I just want to really emphasize how crucial your practice is to the healing of the world. In the first 17 years of my adult life, I witnessed firsthand the consequences of an unawakened global family, extreme poverty, unjust economic disparity, and the brutalization of war. Most approaches to humanitarian services were lacking a crucial component: practices that supported an awakening to unconscious motivations for attempting to do good in the world. Unawakened do-gooders often perpetuate the very destruction they're trying to clean up. This unconscious projection leaves us spinning our wheels and lacking real power to make substantial and sustainable change in our shared reality. In the humanitarian organization that I was a part of for 17 years, I witnessed and experienced our community attempting to heal division between the global rich and poor, meanwhile rejecting the spiritual poverty of their coworkers and themselves through various forms of judgment and fragmentation, which led to painful and in some cases irreparable relational damage, perpetuating the kind of destructive reality we were trying to clean up out there, unable to recognize the projection. I love what Richard Rohr says, something like, the way we do anything is the way we do everything. And the older I get, the more I realize how much we create our reality. And if there's any incongruence between what's happening in here and what's happening out there, we need to examine our practice, our spiritual practice, and our commitment to the spiritual journey. Thomas Keating's Programs for Happiness gave me a helpful framework to see my own unconscious motivations and the ultimate harm they cause myself and others. Self-abnegation or denial of self, or sometimes understood as hiding oneself to please others or be accepted, leads to a limited life for myself, nothing like the fullness of life that Jesus pointed to, and ultimately being a part of the problem of patriarchy and various fragmentations around the planet. And I reached a point in my 30s where I had to really reckon with the way in which my unconscious motivations were contributing to the problems that I was seeing around me in the church, in community, and around the world. Centering prayer, the welcoming prayer, focusing, the Enneagram, somatic experiencing, and traumatic release exercise have all helped me to pay attention to the three intelligences available to each of us: mind, heart, and body. And when all intelligence centers are open and online, wisdom, clarity, and the higher or true self can really emerge and come through. Contemplation is essentially observation, training the inner observer or witness to take inventory of commentary in the mind through thoughts, the heart through emotions, and the body through sensations. And this opens up a world of helpful information for living from a higher state of consciousness, a consciousness that enables us to be present and discern the higher and holier and truest or purest approach to everyday life situations, and then cooperate with one another for collective healing and transformation. So becoming a skillful contemplative or skillful observer through three-centered awareness is the key that unlocks the door to connection with higher self, God, and others. Through practices like centering prayer, we develop capacity to be present. And once we can be present, we can observe the mind, heart, and body wisdom. Once we can observe reality then from the inside out, we can connect with others in healthy, non-dysfunctional ways. And once that mutual connection happens, the sky really is the limit for the new kind of world we can create, one marked by equity, compassion, and innovation. When Thomas Keating gathered Justin, Stewart, Rafael, and I, along with several other younger contemplatives, we asked him, "Why did you bring us all together?" His response was, "I just want you to know one another." That's it. No agenda, no expectation. "I just want you to know one another," he said. Thomas knew that when we are free enough from our unconscious motivation, so that then we can really know one another, we will be able to make the connections necessary to cooperate together from our higher self in the healing of the world. And so what I'd like to do, perhaps a little unusual for a presentation of this sort, but rather than just listen to me and talk for the next 10 minutes, I've said what I want to say, and what I really want to do is guide us in a practice of three-centered awareness. And maybe by doing so, we'll be able to even receive more from our time together. Would that be okay? And I see Pat Johnson out there. I just want to say hello. She saved my life in a number of ways in Snowmass. So nice to see you. Okay, so with this being said, let me just invite you to first orient yourself to the room. So just kind of taking in what you can see, what you can hear, what you can smell. Start there. And pay particular attention to anything that gives you a sense of peace, safety, calm, maybe joy. And then you might notice what you can taste in the mouth. And what you can feel on the skin. So just really letting yourself connect with your embodied nature. Just notice for a moment what it's like to be in your body. You may notice some discomfort, tension. And so feel free to make any adjustments in your seat to better support and accommodate the body. Just giving some reverence to the body, really noticing how hard it works for us. And then notice yourself sitting in the chair. Notice the support of the chair and the support of the earth beneath you. And if at any point you feel any kind of disorientation, just know that you can come back to your senses and come back to the room and come back to that sense of being embodied and being safe right here, right now. And so just take a moment to notice what it's like to be right here, right now. And notice that in this moment, everything is okay. And now I'll invite you to take 3 deep belly breaths with me here. Let's inhale together and exhale completely. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. And now notice how the breath moves in and down on the in breath, up and out on the out breath. Belly and chest rise on the in breath and fall on the out breath. So just getting familiar with that inner landscape, that inner riverbed, if you will. Noticing how the breath passes through this channel as it moves in and down, up and out. And notice this automatic cyclical nature of breath without you having to do anything. You just get to watch and observe. Notice how breath moves in and touches the base of the brain where it reverses direction, traveling down through heart space and dropping down into the belly, the bottom of the belly where it reverses direction again, traveling up through belly center, heart center, and the mind. So notice how the breath connects all 3 centers, all 3 brains, all 3 intelligences, mind, heart, body, connected by breath. And as you're watching that movement of breath, begin to take some inventory of what you notice in the mind. Any thoughts, memories. Perhaps the mind is rather still. Just notice without judgment, without commentary. Just notice the activity of the mind. As breath passes through heart center, see if there are any emotions coming to the surface here, or maybe lingering underneath the surface. Maybe there's no sense of emotion at all. Just notice. You may notice the emotion of peace or joy or gratitude, frustration, sadness. Just notice. And then dropping down into the belly center, the gateway to the body. Notice any sensations. Noticing any sensations that may be registering inside the body or on the surface of the body. You may notice overt sensations like discomfort or pain, or perhaps the feel of the wind on your skin. Just notice any sensations that are surfacing here. You might notice more subtle sensations within. You may notice some sensation of like radiation, like a radiating, vibrating energy on the inside or on the surface. Just notice. So just taking inventory of thoughts, memories, emotions, or sensations. Notice yourself right here, right now. Very dynamic human being with at least 3 portals to communion with mystery. And just see if you can cultivate, generate a sense of compassion for what you're noticing, a sense of gratitude, and just kind of bathing the mind, heart, body with undivided attention. Noticing the sense of being awake, alert. And I'll invite you to take one deep belly breath with me here. And exhale. Notice yourself sitting in the chair. Notice the feet rooted to the earth. Just gently bow the mind to the heart, which is situated in the body. Giving reverence for this temple of the Holy Spirit. We can bring the palms together to the heart. And if the eyes are still closed, you can gently open the eyes and just kind of look around. Noticing the gift of being right here, right now, in this time and space, the gift of life, the opportunity to love, to create a better world simply with your presence. Thank you.
Thank you, Phileena, for guiding us in that wonderful practice of quietness and awareness of ourselves. After that practice, I didn't want to comment, but I think that you bring us into the conversation a very important topic about the unconscious motivations of how rules the world. So I think that's something important to take into account, how the contemplative practice can transform those who are in the leadership position. I have always thinking that we need more contemplative politics and more contemplative leaders to guide us in these times. Well, we have now one of the most strictest fellows in our gathering. Justin is very, very serious. You will see right after. But I will make a short introduction of Justin. Father Justin served as a priest and a curate of St. Clement Church, Philadelphia, in the Episcopal Diocese of Pennsylvania. He previously served in Bennington, Vermont, where he was a rector of St. Peter's Church. Justin's formation includes time in the Trappist monastery, St. Benedict Snowmass, where he was under the abbey of Abbot Joseph Doyle and the direction of Father Thomas Keating. He continued to be guided by these two men until their death in 2018. And as a part of his formation, Abbot Joseph sent him to train in Zen monasticism. This led him to Kyoto, Japan, where he entered the training monastery to Fukusadu as a non-clerical monk under Keito Fukushima Rashi, resigned Zen master and head abbot of Tofukiji. Justin is joined by his wife Heather and their two young daughters. Let's hear from you, Justin. It's always good to see you.
It's good to see you. Thank you for the intro. I'm very strict. I'm super strict. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Look, I'm going to get right into this. I'm super excited to talk with everybody. So I want to talk today from the field as a practitioner, particularly in some of the changing contexts with the pandemic. I mean, so as my life as a priest, as a parent, as a homemaker, but like especially during the pandemic. So my level of focus is going to kind of be on a small scale, not quite a granular scale, but the things that I'm engaged in institutionally, if people want to talk about that in the breakout sessions, it's no problem. During the last couple years, and in particularly the pandemic again, my roles changed quite a bit as a dad, as a teacher at home, etc. So there are a few distinctions that happened in my practice that kind of became more intensified or emerged more clearly that I really found helpful. So I want to share them off with you guys. So as some of you know, I'm regularly working with some central text in our contemplative tradition, other than Holy Scripture. That means that I've been poring over the collections like the Cloud Corpus, and that includes like the Cloud of Unknowing and the Letter of Privy Council, two of the most famous ones. And also the Dionysian Corpus, which is especially includes the De Mystica Theologia, or the Mystical Theology by Blessed Dionysius the Areopagite. Now, there are so many other really great works, but I'm going to refer to these two collections today. So I wanted to just let you know. And in the breakout room, if you want exact details of translations, et cetera, go ahead and we'll talk about it. So these two texts have a special place in the Christian contemplative tradition, especially in the West and in the centering prayer movement. Not only has Thomas Keating talked about, cloud of unknowing and mystical theology, but you could hardly get a drink of water with William Menninger without a copy of the Cloud of Unknowing just drifting by. And from Thomas, Thomas also would teach from time to time about what he called attentiveness, but he also called it spaciousness, and I'm just going to lump them together and call them spacious attentiveness. And you can find it in his writings, particularly in his book, Consenting to God as God Is, particularly in the vocation chapter. So here's a little quote from Thomas. Attentiveness is a broad and unlimited kind of perception or experience, a spaciousness, you might say, in which everything is contained. You do not think of any particular thing. It is a movement from things to what is. Now, in the Letter of Privy Council, one of these works in the Cloud Corpus, there's an analog to this movement from things to what is, this spacious attentiveness. And the Cloud author invites us to offer to God that simple awareness of the substance of your being, not your activities or your qualities, but your very being itself. So I'd like to suggest that in this group, that many of us have been preparing our faculties and our bodies in general for the dawning of this kind of spacious attentiveness, especially in our practice of walking meditation in conjunction with our sitting. So for instance, if you've ever been to an intensive or a post-intensive, or maybe your regular group, there's a sit and there's a walk. And then maybe there's another sit and maybe there's a Lectio. Now, of course, you could take this also into chanting, you could take it into the liturgy, you could take it into the offices, etc. But for most of us, in contemplative outreach, we have experienced the sit and the walk. The Letter of Privy Council has this really wonderful way of talking about what Thomas calls the spacious attentiveness. It goes like this: I am, and I see, and I experience that I am. And in walking our centering prayer, we have the senses open, and it's kind of a way of continuing our intention, consenting to the divine presence in action. And meanwhile, we're walking. We're preparing the heart and the body, and simply letting faith be the foundation of our activity. So with the senses open, the mind open, the heart open, we are seemingly being taught to walk in what is. And in my case, this came to the forefront, especially in the pandemic sense. A number of my other disciplines and devotions, etc., were really diminished because of the time crunch. Like Rafael said, I've got 2 little girls, and the pandemic, particularly the last school year, was just, I mean, there was very little precious time without kids around. And so anyway, like a lot of the side dishes of my my spiritual feast, a lot of the side dishes just had to go back in the fridge. I didn't get to pray the offices with chant, which I love. Not that I'm good at it. Protracted Lectio Divina got minimized. And meanwhile, my parenting duties dramatically got maximized. Yeah, so as Rafael said, I serve as a priest and a curate at St. Clement's Church in Philadelphia. And, you know, this is a relatively new post for me. I was actually called during the pandemic. And so a little caveat here, I had a lot of new liturgical practices to learn just to be able to serve there. Yeah, and in many ways, it was almost like starting from scratch. So anyways, I also serve as a dad of these two wonderful school-age young girls, and the oldest of whom has a very rare genetic syndrome, 4P minus. Now, a caveat, my wife has written a book on our first couple years called Raising a Rare Girl. I should have thought to give a link to it, but I'm slow at this internet stuff. And so for those of you interested in understanding 4P minus or our parenting experience, from your local bookstore, or if you got to go to Amazon, the monster, anyway, Raising a Rare Girl's in there. Now, I have to say, for me, in the kind of contemplative role model world, Father Joseph, Abba Joseph, of course, is there, and Father Thomas is there. And in many ways, Pat Johnson is there, especially in the example of her parenting with Sarah, which, unbeknownst to me, when I was in the monastery initially as like a 20-year-old, early 20s, I didn't realize that she was role modeling a lot of this stuff for me. So in that same vein, I also now serve, new role for me, as the primary homemaker since our move from the Green Mountains of Vermont to the Garden State of New Jersey. Now, as you can imagine, with COVID-19, the pandemic first hit just like about 6 months after we've gotten here. And it was a complicated scramble because if you've ever moved from Vermont to New Jersey, there is a culture shock, one of which is the drivers here are quite daring. And once the pandemic hit, toilet paper was hard to come by. So if I may, and now that you kind of get a little sense of the mix here, and you get a sense also of like Thomas's and the Letter of Privy Council's spacious attentiveness, there is in the 5th chapter of the Book of Privy Council, just this wonderful section. It's a little long, but I've found it so helpful over the last couple of years, especially in my personal context at home with the kids. So please bear with me, because even as Father William insisted that you didn't need much specialized knowledge in Middle English to work with these texts, it's clear to me that my Middle English could use some help. So here it goes. So keep yourself whole and unscattered as far as you can by grace and by the art of spiritual continuance. For in this dark contemplation of the substance of your being, you must do all that you have to do. Eat and drink, sleep and awaken, walk and sit, speak and be silent, lie down and get up, stand and kneel, run and ride, labor and rest. Zoom school your children. Make them breakfast, make them lunch, make them dinner. Wipe their noses, wipe their chins, wipe their butts. Do your work remotely at home while also helping the kids do their work in the same room. Put them to sleep again, put them back to sleep yet again. And every day you must offer up to God this dark contemplation of the substance of your being as the most precious offering you can make. It must take first place in all your activity, whether what you are doing be styled active or contemplative. Now, I might have come across the rather abridged version of this Middle English text. So if you are a scholar of Middle English, please be in touch with me if you've also come across this version. But as you can see, the letter of Privy Council here is really directing us to do all we have to do in as much as grace allows in this kind of spacious attentiveness, much like in walking meditation. Now, I mean, when I was young, I would say I didn't deeply value the walking meditation part. When I had time, I was all about the sitting. And when I was in a monastery, even Father Thomas would be like, "Yo, Brother Justin, like, you're sitting an awful lot." And I told him, I was like, "Yeah, man, I'm on this thing." And then he very kindly let me know that the life itself, the monastic life itself, but life in general, from a contemplative standpoint, has its own aspect, its own dynamic. And so anyway, so we want to offer to God this most precious offering we can make, letting it be primary. First, let it be the basis of all we do. And in the pandemic, with these kids always in my ear, always right in front of me, the spacious attentiveness was this invitation for this to be first. Now, if grace unravels us in this spacious attentiveness, our thoughts may well be present, but all of a sudden they're like released. Our attraction to them has been released, and we're called for this kind of artful continuance of letting be. And this openness envelops all that we are doing as we cook, we clean, we advocate for our children, we help them learn how to read a clock or do their physical therapy. Even our emotional life with all its flourish may very well be there, but there's something about it that is released in this spacious attentiveness. And in the tight quarters of Zoom schooling, as maybe you are aware, this was super helpful that it started to emerge with more intensity. Now, the contemplation of the substance of your being in the letter of Privy Council is set alongside another teaching. And it is not only, the letter is not only teaching us about this kind of preparation of spacious attentiveness, but it's also teaching the forgetting of all awareness of oneself. And so here's a relatively unadulterated quote. Although I directed you to forget everything but the feeling of the being of yourself, yet it is my wish, and it was my intention from the beginning, that you should forget the feeling of the being of yourself in exchange for the feeling of the being of God. This part of the cloud's teaching, the cloud corpus's teaching, more directly relates to what I consider my seated centering prayer, where I'm letting go of anything that collapses, this attentiveness, where I'm just letting be all that is. And at the bottom of the heart, I am just surrender itself, where I'm hidden in the surrender of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, here I have also benefited from an older text, the Mystica Theologia, by the Blessed Dionysius the Areopagite, because here, so succinctly, we're invited into a super mentum cognoscens, and that is cognizance beyond the mind. And this is in the Mystical Theology, the first chapter, the 6th section in Sarazen's Latin translation, which is the translation that the Cloud author had at his disposal. And I feel like these two aspects of contemplative practice, there are situations for me where the gift and practice of spacious attentiveness comes into play more. And then there are times when the invitation to utterly forget my very self, to surrender all aspects of body and soul, becomes more pronounced. And often, for me, I tend to use, in teaching centering prayer in parishes and retreats, I tend to use, among the basic guidelines of contemplative outreach, 3 prompts: let go, let be, and be surrender. And if your spacious attentiveness has collapsed or fixed itself as attention, we simply let go of the thing or the thought. So if you've got a hold of something, you're hooked by something, you let it go. Most of us are plainly aware of this first part. And an activity in our life, whatever thoughts may or may not be there, we just let it be. We let be whatever is just as it is. We let our relationship to these things or thoughts, we let them heal and untie in our bodies as we let utter faith be our guide. And with God's grace, the practice of centering prayer has been over time facilitating these pathways in the soul and in our bodies, in our nervous systems and in our bones. I am reminded of just how physical these pathways are, especially when I approach the altar with a kiss, where its relics are set in the stone. And then when I see the great relics that adorn the high altar at St. Clement's, I'm reminded of the integration of the divine energy throughout the soul and the body. And today, on his feast day, we can also be reminded of Blessed Joseph of Cupertino, who Father Thomas would mention from time to time, who would levitate at the sacred name of Jesus. And yet, as Father Thomas famously pointed out, his blessedness was not due to the gift of bodily flight, but his utter humility of body and soul. Again, whether what you do be styled active or contemplative, do all that you have to do in this dark contemplation of the substance of your being, or rather, do all you have to do from this spacious attentiveness. Now, maybe you can start to see some crossover here from silence and liturgical prayer and parenting and active homemaking, the stillness and the movements of the body, the dynamic play, even of the intentions in the prayers of the Mass, teaching kids mathematics, the hands-on occupational therapy. These were all activities that I was invited to do in the spacious attentiveness, inasmuch as the Spirit unveiled it in me, and in as much as artful continuance offered. I would like to touch on one more part here, particularly the be surrender, because for me, this prompt helps ground the entirety of my practice in the utter surrender of Christ. It's easy sometimes, I think, to think that I am the backstop here, but this be surrender part at the bottom of the heart, it's this kind of gentle cue that helps me recognize that it's not my surrender that's at the bottom. It is Christ's surrender. Through sheer grace, it is Christ's own surrender as my innermost. And this intention, or the cue, is a way for me to kind of rest at the edge of myself, this letting be all that is, and the gentle release of my individual faith, so that Christ's own faith might inform my body and my soul. And surrender in this way is not something I do, but that I am almost like swept away in a profound and primordial invitation into the heart, or as some would say, into the wounds of Christ. And this is at the bottom of spacious attentiveness. Whereas for me, the kind of phenomenal experience is at the front end. At the bottom end is this just surrender, in as much as grace allows. Again, from the Areopagite: set free from what is seen and from that which sees, entering into the truly mystical darkness of unknowing. Also, chapter 1, section 6. So I'd like to end with an image from when I visited Mark Kudalowski, one of the other young contemplatives that TK brought to the conference in Snowmass in 2017. This summer, my family went to visit Mark and Lisa, his wife, and their little baby girl at their home, Metanoia Homestead, way up in my old alma mater, Vermont. One day, our families got to hike into this ravine where there was this lovely creek going through. And as we hiked down in, and then we kind of hiked up the creek to this waterfall that was feeding the creek. And, you know, as you get closer, you begin to smell and feel that freshness of air and the ions pouring off of the rocks and the gentle spray. It's cooling everything down. So, of course, we jumped in and we swam in the frigid cold waters. And now, as we were playing in the waterfall and in the pool, you could scale the rock. And as you scale the rock, you come up to the top part, and there's this pool of calm water. It was clear, it was still, but it did not give off that freshness. It did not give off that ionized spray that's so invigorating. So whether you're swimming at the face of the fall or sliding down it like Mark and Lisa did, brave souls, that freshness comes from the water running over the rocks and the bumps. And our practice is freshened by the silent waters running over the rock face and the contours and the bumps and the juts. Our prayer is actually being freshened by these bumps. They actually help make the freshness multiply, and it mists out over all of us swimmers and hikers. Anyone in here who knew Father Thomas and knew his life knew too well it was filled with rocks and bumps and humiliations and the so-called professional failure. And who among us could ask for anything else? Our Lord himself, seemingly from year 3, had all the rocks and jagged edges, not to mention his crucifixion and the ordeal of his passion. And there is this still, quiet pool, and also the crashing waterfall with its spray. And yet the source of the water, be it underground or sky above, is wholly unseen. And I think this is such a great image for contemplative practice. And so this is what I've been up to recently. I hope that sharing some of it can be a benefit to somebody. Anyway, thank you so kindly for having me and listening to my long talk through the Zoom window. Peace.
Thank you, Justin, for your thoughtful conversation about spaciousness, attentiveness. That's a very interesting concept. I want to finish with some quotes from the final messages of Father Thomas Keating, based on the testimony or also attendee of the Contemplative Gathering 2017, Eric Keeney, who passed away a couple of months ago. It says, "We're called to start not with the old world contracts, now that we know that they are all lies, but what we know is the truth, as proved by silence and sign. So I call upon the nations to consider this as a possibility, that we should begin a new world with one that actually exists. This is the moment to manifest this world by showing loving concern for poverty, loving appreciation for the needs of the world, and opportunities for accelerated development. We need to find ways to make this really happen. And I believe that what we're doing here today, this conference, what has been doing Contemplative Outreach, Extensión Contemplativa Internacional, and all other of the global community is in that direction, looking for ways to find out this happen. And I think that we can move forward and have a conversation in the next segment.